Now let's pan the keyboard tracks in this project, and keyboards are a little bit of a unique animal just like a drum set is, because a drum set is naturally stereo, and you pan those individual tracks to reproduce the stereo image of a drum set, but keyboards have their own stereo output, or at least typically they do. But even if you were listening to an acoustic piano without any microphones on it, it also has a stereo image. So if you were sitting at a piano and playing it, the low notes on the left-hand side of the piano are going to be louder in your left ear than the high notes are on the right-hand side of the piano, which are going to be louder in your right ear. So most keyboard patches have a stereo sort of image already set up in them. But not every keyboard does, especially the old analog instruments like the Moog and sequential circuits instruments. Those usually had a mono output, and then you used effect processors to create a stereo effect or a stereo image. But in our case, our keyboards are already in stereo because I recorded the keyboard's left and right output. So I'm going to solo our keyboard group, and then I'm going to come over to our keyboard tracks, which are right here. But remember how we converted the MIDI track into its own audio track over here? Well, that means I don't need to be looking at this MIDI channel anymore, so I'm going to change its visibility over here in the Visibility tab of our inspector. I'm going to go to the Keys folder, and I'm going to turn off that electric piano MIDI track, and then close up that folder. Now when we come back to the mix console, you can see that that MIDI track has been removed from the mix console. It hasn't been removed from the project, it's just been made invisible. So now we have the keyboard track that came right out of the keyboard, and then we had another one created by Sonic SE, a virtual instrument with a different patch on it. So there are two different sounds for the exact same performance. So let's listen to the sound that came out of the keyboard originally. And to be able to hear that a little bit better, I'm going to turn up the keyboard group over here. Now, if you're listening to it in stereo, you'll be able to tell that there is a phaser effect on this that makes it sound stereo. If we listen to it in mono, you'll be able to hear it a little bit easier. So let's listen to it in mono and stereo. See, so that patch was stereo, and it was created that way by using a stereo effect in the keyboard. So I recorded that onto a stereo track. Now let's listen to the patch that came out of Sonic SE. And you can hear that it's in stereo too. Let's listen to that in mono and stereo. Now let's listen to them both at the same time. And I really like how those sound played simultaneously. So it's the same sort of concept with guitars. You can layer patches together and get a bigger, fatter sound. But as far as where we pan those in the stereo field, we've got a lot of different options because we could pan them over to the left or right. But because those guitars aren't playing all the time, that means we're going to be able to hear the keyboards more easily when the guitars aren't playing. So we may just leave these tracks dead center because their stereo image is already created inside of the instrument itself. So let's try that. Let's listen to those tracks in context with the other instruments, and we're going to pay particular attention to where the guitars and the keyboards are in relation to one another so that we make sure that the guitars and the keyboards aren't fighting one another. So we're just going to really have to use our ears here. Maybe we should just solo the guitars and the keyboards to hear if there's any competition going on. So let's start from the beginning of the project and take a listen. Well, there is some competition going on. Whenever the guitars are playing, I've kind of lost some of the impact from those keyboard parts. So perhaps what we should do is pan the guitars and the keyboards apart a little bit. So let's take the guitar group and pan it over to the left a little bit. And then let's take the keyboards and pan them over to the right a little bit. Maybe even a little bit further to the right. Now they're a little bit easier to tell apart from one another. Now let's listen to those in stereo and mono. Now let's bring back the bass tracks and the drum tracks. And that starts to sound really good. Let's listen to it in mono and stereo. See how when we're in mono, it's just kind of a mess? We really can't hear any of those instruments. It's harder to pick them out of the mix. But when we listen to it in stereo, we can more easily hear each and every one of those instrument tracks. So that's how you can pan keyboard parts, and bear in mind that where you pan them is largely dependent upon whether the tracks were recorded in stereo with a stereo instrument or whether they were mono instruments, and then you may need to pan those from left to right to make sure that they don't compete with other instruments in the same frequency range, like guitars and bass. And I'll talk about those frequency ranges in our next section, but we still need to do the vocal tracks, and we're going to do that in the next tutorial.